Hi there. Today we're going to be talking about how the artist's eye level affects the way that artists should be drawing their ellipses. So for our homework assignment, for one of our take-home assignments, we'll be drawing a whole bunch of different shaped cylinders. To be a cylinder, you definitely want to make sure that the end view of this is round. It's not a good choice to choose something like this that might seem like it's the right kind of thing, but when you look at it from end view, it's actually rectangular. So this is not great for doing ellipses. Another kind of problem type shape, even though this seems like it might be the right kind of thing, if you look at the bottom of it, it's certainly not a circle either. It's more elliptical and oval shaped, and so that is going to that will actually distort the shape of the ellipses, and it's just going to kind of mess up your drawing. So as you're choosing objects, be sure to always choose things that really are round when you're looking at them from the end, and not things that are distorted somehow. So eye level is an imaginary plane that extends out horizontally from the artist's eye level. Now, that eye level is going to stay horizontal and parallel to the ground plane, regardless of whether you're looking up at something on the ceiling or looking down at something on the floor. That eye level always extends straight out from your eye level. So in this first example, we've got an object that's below our eye level, and the flatter ellipse is closer to our eye level than the ones that are rounder at the very bottom of this cylinder. So in this case, the very flat ellipse might be here, and then the longer the object is, the more and more rounded it becomes. So maybe at this point, this ellipse is going to be a little bit rounder than this one, but not quite as round as the one at the bottom. So I'm going to make this one even a little bit rounder. The other thing I'm going to be asking you to do in all of your drawings is to scribe in the axis lines of each. The object itself, we're going to describe this as the long axis of the object. And then you're also going to be adding in secondary axis lines, which are the short axes that will actually, it runs the length of the ellipse, but it would actually be the shorter axis when you're looking at the object itself. So again, we'll refer to the whole thing as the cylinder, and then each individual little oval here, we'll just refer to them as the ellipses within the object. So that's a really basic form. There's no tricky labels. The object's the same width from top to bottom, so we don't need to worry about changing the width of the object and adjusting the ellipse proportions according to the width, but that's a really simple object to start with. Here's another little bit more complex object, but it's still drawn as if it's below our eye level. So we can see that the ellipse at the top of this wire basket is much flatter than the one that is resting on the turquoise fabric, which is becoming closer to a circle. So it's being tipped up a little bit more from our point of view, and it appears closer to a circle than to a straight line. You're also going to need to draw an object as if it's suspended above your eye level. Now that's sometimes tricky to find in your own household. If you have can lighting or if you have a lampshade, you'll be able to get up underneath a form, but it may be that you have to kind of create that illusion. And in this case, I had to actually flip this photograph over in order to make it feel like this thing is up above our eye level. You can also mimic that effect by laying an object so that it's in front of you and you're seeing the bottom edge of it. So that gives the same kind of illusion as if it were suspended above your head. So that may be an option that you need to resort to if you're drawing these things from objects at home. So in this case, again, the closer the ellipse is to your eye level, the flatter it needs to be. And then as the object extends farther away, those ellipses will get a little bit rounder. And again, you'll be putting in the axis lines to help check your proportions. It's also important that we darken in the foreground parts of the ellipses so that it's clear to the viewer that we're seeing through the objects. You're going to be drawing these objects as if they're transparent, even if they are not transparent in real life, so that I can check the accuracy of your ellipses, even on the hidden end of the cylinders. So here's an example of a wine bottle that I laid on its side to give the illusion of it being hovering above our heads so that we can draw those ellipses. And in this case, the foot of the bottle, the very bottom of it would be our flattest ellipse. And then if we're drawing in ellipses for the bottom of the label edge and the top edge of the label, and then also where the neck attaches to the shoulders of the object, there should be another ellipse there. And as we get farther and farther from our eye level, those ellipses need to get rounder and rounder. So in this case, the very roundest ellipse would be the mouth of the bottle because it's farthest from the viewer's eye level. Now this one gets tricky, and students often have a problem with this one. This is where you've got the object right on your eye level. So you're not able to see the ellipse on the bottom and you're not able to see the ellipse on the top of the cup. So let me see if I can get it positioned to the camera the way this might be if it were right on our eye level. So we're actually looking up at this ellipse and we're looking down at this ellipse and we're not able to see into either end of the object. So in this case, it's really important to draw in for me where your eye level is. And if you're not sure, you can just extend your hand physically out from your eye, and wherever it hits that object that you're drawing, that would be your eye level. So you would draw in a dotted line for me. In this photograph, I had to figure out where the eye level might be, and so I estimated based on how flat the ellipses were. And I knew the eye level would be closest to my flattest ellipse. So I felt like that the one that's just below my dotted line was a little bit flatter than the one above it, and I kind of guesstimated where that eye level might be. But we know for sure it's not at the very top of the object because we're looking up at the underside of that ellipse, and it's definitely rounder than the two that are toward the middle of the object. So we knew the eye level had to be somewhere in the middle there. So if you're drawing an object on your eye level, if it's, let's say it's extending farther above the eye level, since this is a greater distance, this ellipse would need to be a little bit rounder than one that might be, let's say you want to end it here. This one should be a little bit flatter because it's closer to our eye level. I hope that makes sense. So again, if you add the little axis lines in, it can help you see that. And in this case, I darkened it in a little too dark. It's confusing, and it almost feels like we're looking down at the top of that ellipse. So what I need to do is, it'd be better if I use my kneaded eraser for this, but it's not unwrapped right now. So I need to lighten the back side of each of these ellipses so it's really clear to the viewer that we're seeing through a transparent form and we're not looking down at the top of the object. If it's easier, I suggest maybe using a dotted line on the parts of the ellipses that are on the back side of the object and using a solid line on the parts of the ellipses that are closer to us so that there's no question about which way we're looking at the object. So this is an object that's on eye level, and again, you would have to draw in a dotted line for me representing where eye level is if you want full credits on this project. So here we've got that same wire basket or a similar one, and we've dropped down our eye level really low, like our eyes are almost at the level of the table, not quite. You can tell that the top ellipse is probably our roundest one, so it's farther from our eye level than the other two ellipses are. So on the next slide, I kind of estimated where I think the eye level might be in this photograph. Since we're still looking down on the two lowest ellipses, they're very, very flat, but they're not absolutely a straight line. If either one of those had been a perfectly straight line, then we know that is our eye level. All right, now the fourth project is going to be pretty hard. It's an object laying on its side, so I suggest you do these projects in order. This would be probably the easiest one to do, the one with the object slightly below our eye level. Then maybe tackle number 2, which is putting the object above your eye level and remembering that the ellipse on the bottom side of the object needs to be our flattest one since it's closest to our eye level. The third one's kind of tricky too. It may help to actually put water in the object that you're drawing, or in the container that you're drawing, and put the water level on your eye level. Get it so that the water is a perfectly straight line, and then we'll be looking up at the mouth of the object and down at the base of the object, and it may help you locate your horizon line a little bit better for that third object. But the fourth object is tricky because the ellipses don't relate as clearly to where our eye level is since we've changed the orientation of the whole cylinder. So if it helps you, in your mind you could rotate that object so that it looks as though it's sitting upright on the table again, and that'll help you know which ellipse needs to be flattest. But if that's confusing to you, just remember that the end that we can see clearly should always be flatter than the ellipses at the end that we can't see clearly. And again, here we have a glass jar, so it's easy to see all of the ellipses, but on most objects, you're going to be looking through colored glass, or you're going to be imagining through an opaque object like, a mug or a tin can or something, and you're not really going to be able to see that ellipse at the far end of the object. So know that it just has to be rounder than the ellipse that is on the visible end of the object. So the first thing as you're drawing objects that are laying on its side is figuring out the orientation. So you can use your skewer. We talked a lot about figuring angles, but you're estimating the basic angle of the object, and you draw that in first. And then you're going to have to remember that, we want to get the center line in. Most of these things are pretty symmetrical. And then as you're drawing in the ellipses, you want to make sure that the long axis of the ellipses are perpendicular to this axis, which means we're looking for a 90-degree angle here to make sure that we're not distorting the object. And then remember that the end of the object that we can see clearly needs to be a little bit flatter than the end that we can't see. So in this case, since this object is kind of the same width all the way along, I can use my skewer or a pencil and just make sure that this ellipse, so if it were the same, it would be about here, but I need to make it a little bit rounder. So I can just move those marks out a little bit fatter and then pencil in the ellipse and draw in the solid line. So you're going to draw in any visible lines and then leave the far side of the ellipses dotted, especially on the hidden end. Okay, so this would be our object number 1, object 2 above eye level, object 3 on our eye level, object 4 something lying on its side, and then get back to our slideshow here. Okay, here's another object lying on its side. In this case, we are looking at the bottom side of it, but it still would be constructed the same way that we did this much simpler object, where you establish the basic orientation of the object first, and then plot out the shorter axis lines. Here's a different view. Again, this would work fine for an object lying on its side. This is quite a complex object because we've got a width change, and we've got details like the label that adds complexity. All right, I think the thing that's very hardest for most people to draw is an object that's extremely foreshortened. So in order to meet my requirements for being foreshortened enough, I'm going to have certain things that I'm going to be looking for. So first is that the ellipse at the far end of the object is intersecting the ellipse that is closer to us. So in this case, we're really close to the one end of the ellipse, or one end of the cylinder, but I darkened in so if you can see this is the original photograph, and then I made a blue ellipse to show the far end. So I want those two ellipses at the two ends to intersect, kind of like wedding rings, where they are Olympic rings, where they have to cross one another in order to meet my requirement for being foreshortened enough. What I don't want to see is an end view where we're just looking absolutely down into the end of the object. That's too simple, actually. You're just drawing almost like a bullseye where the one circle fits inside the other one. But what we're looking for is a view that's a little bit, where we see a little bit of the side, but not very much. So again, we don't want a dead-on side view. We don't want a dead-on end view. We need to see a little bit of the side of the object, but I do want to be able to see the inside ellipse, which is the foot of the object. We need to be able to see it through the opening at the top of the object to meet my requirements for being extremely foreshortened. All right, now I've darkened in the other ellipses, so I want you to notice that these ellipses all need to be drawn in on this object. If you see, this one has pinstriping around it, but anywhere the object changes size, you're going to be adding an ellipse. So some of these objects, even though they seem fairly simple, you might be drawing 4 or 5 ellipses for a single object. All right, now, because this object happens to also be laying on its side, we're going to be using that center line of the whole cylinder, draw that in to divide it in half like we did for this object number 4. And then make sure that when you're drawing the ellipses at all those different points along the cylinder, that you're keeping the wider dimension of that, or the longer axis of that individual ellipse perpendicular. So you don't want to make it look lopsided. And again, the way to check this is once your drawing is done, rotate it around as if the drawing is sitting upright. Like in this case, if I'm checking this one, I would just turn it and check to see, does this ellipse look right compared to this, or is it lopsided? It shouldn't look like the end of a piece of lipstick. It shouldn't be on an angle. And that's a really common problem that students have when they're trying to draw an object laying on its side or a foreshortened object. So turning your paper can really help you see those mistakes with fresh eyes. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to be looking for these extremely foreshortened objects is I want the sides of the object that probably in real life may have been parallel to one another. When the object's foreshortened enough, what happens is those lines that we know in real life were vertical, they actually start to optically converge at a point on our horizon line or on our eye level line. So in this case, I've drawn in some red lines to show how, even though we know that object, that the sides in real life run parallel and they don't get closer together, from this particular point of view, you're actually going to see some pretty extreme convergence of those lines that in real life would be parallel to one another. So I'm going to be looking for the ellipse at the bottom to be smaller than the ellipse at the top in order to have those sides go back into space sufficiently. The other thing you should notice is how much shorter the length has become now, because we're seeing it from an angle. We're not seeing it from side view. So even though we know from having seen this object from other points of view that it's much, much longer than it is wide, from this particular point of view, it actually looks like, the length of it is shorter than the distance across that ellipse, which is kind of surprising. So trust your measurements. Don't trust what your brain thinks you know about the object. Trust the measurements you take from that particular point of view to make that foreshortening really convincing. So in order to locate my eye level, I just need to extend those converging lines until they meet, and that pinpoints exactly where my eye level is. So I'm going to show you a drawn in eye level line here. So you can do that anytime. When you see a building and it seems like the top of the building and the bottom of the building are merging because you're seeing it in perspective, you can just follow those two lines until they meet, and that locates the artist's eye level. It's a pretty cool trick. And here's an example of another extremely foreshortened object. It's a wine glass. I added some water to the wine glass, so we have another ellipse that we can look at. So I've darkened in the axis line that runs right through the wine glass. I've also darkened in the ellipse at the mouth of the wine glass, which is almost a circle. It's not going to be a perfect circle, and that's another thing to remember about that the fifth object that we're going to be drawing, the extremely foreshortened object. Those ellipses can't be a perfect circle, so don't trace, don't trace your cylinder right onto your paper. You have to make it slightly flattened, and then as we get farther from the top of the object, as we move toward the hidden end of the object, those ellipses need to get slightly rounder and rounder. They will never be a perfect circle unless we are looking directly down inside the object, which is not the view that I want you to draw it from. So try to keep it slightly off from a true circle. So here we've got the ellipse that's at the water level. It's slightly rounder. It's hard to judge because these all appear nearly round, but it's slightly closer to a circle than that first ellipse that I showed you. And then adding in the very base ellipse, again, you would draw it transparently, but just darken in the parts that are visible and use a dotted line. Here it's not dotted, but that top quarter of it, I would have made a dotted line if I were doing it in a drawing. So that one is the closest to a circle, but again, it's not a perfect circle. So I'm going to do a quick sketch here of how you might construct an extremely foreshortened object. Again, it doesn't need to really relate to our eye level the way the other ones do, but just in the interest of space, I guess I'll work up here. So again, thinking about an object like a cup or anything, my first step would be to put in an axis line and carefully measure out the top ellipse that I can see. And you figure out some sort of ratio of height to width. It'll be nearly circular, but not quite. You know, kind of fine tune your curves here. And then the one that's further down, they're going to have converging sides typically, so you'd have to kind of measure how much smaller that other ellipse is. And then this one at the other end is going to be slightly rounder. And again, draw the lines in dotted to start with, and then the parts that are visible, you're going to darken in. So right here what I was doing was I was finding the midpoint of the base ellipse and the midpoint of the upper ellipse and just connecting them with a straight line. That usually works really well to draw the sides of the object. And then if you want to show that the object has some thickness to it, like it's a ceramic mug, you might come in with a second ellipse inside the first one. And again, you can lighten the lines that might be confusing things where you want it to appear more transparent. But that's a pretty simplified object. Let's say you do have an object that has a handle on it. I usually try to imagine that the handle is aiming right toward the center of the object. So in your sketch, if you can think about where that center is and work out from there, that often will give you a good start on how to, this top part of the handle. And then I'm following these same lines of convergence when I'm thinking about the handle. And again, I'm kind of making it somewhat simplified. But I'm also thinking about where it might attach. So let's say it attaches here, if we could see through the object, and then it might also attach here, and then you kind of pencil it in as if you could see through the mug to that handle. And there might even be a side plane here that we want to establish. So we're thinking of it kind of as a three-dimensional form. But again, if the part that is hidden by the metal, we'll just draw as a dotted line. But I do want you to really think about how those things might connect if we could see through the inside of the mug and construct it that way. So this would be our object 5, drawn extremely foreshortened. And I'll give you a little more details about how to make things more complicated. These are just the most simple forms. If you drew objects that were this simple, like a tin can, you might be eligible to get, say, 60 to 70 points out of 100. If you want to really challenge yourself, I'm going to be expecting you to choose some more complex objects as you get the hang of this if you want to shoot for an A or a B. But even doing this kind of simplicity could definitely give you a passing grade on the project. All right, good luck.